text comes from 2 Corinthians 4. It's the text following our text from this morning. This time we'll read verses 7 through 12. It's page 937 of your Pew Bible. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 7. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. Brothers and sisters, this morning we began our three-part sermon series on 2 Corinthians 4, a chapter in which Paul outlines what comforts and encourages him in the face of adversity. The title of the series is called "The Servant of Christ is Encouraged in Adversity." We saw this morning that the Apostle Paul is first encouraged by the fact that it's Jesus Christ who initiated his ministry and who sustains it and who drives it. It's not Paul who decided to be an apostle. It's Jesus who chose him. And therefore, his ministry is not about his fancy methods or things like that. This afternoon in verses 7 through 12, we come to the second major encouragement of Paul's ministry. And the second encouragement comes from when Paul calls himself a jar of clay, or a vessel of earthenware. You might be puzzled at first. How could such a thing be encouraging to Paul? How does calling oneself a clay pot offer encouragement? In order to understand why this might be, we need to spend a little bit of time talking about the background in Corinth. You see, Paul's writing to the city of Corinth, to the believers who lived there. Corinth was a famous city in the ancient Near East. It was known all around the Roman world. It was a wealthy trading city, cosmopolitan. All walks of people lived and worked there. And it was famous for many things, but Corinth was particularly famous for its orators, or public speakers, we could say. Corinth was full of men who would walk around in Corinth and stand at street corners and in the squares, and these men would speak to the people. And in an age before TV or before widespread literacy, such a thing was pretty entertaining. It was something that the people really enjoyed and wanted to see. And the Corinthian public speakers were famous for their emotionally manipulative but empty speaking. They would entertain the crowds, but not necessarily always say a lot. They were also notorious for pursuing status and popularity and wealth, much like our movie stars do today. They often thought so highly of themselves that they often considered themselves divinely favored and equipped by the gods. In fact, they had become so famous or infamous in this way that one Roman author even mocked them. And he mocked the excessive grooming of some of them, a particular fellow named Terminian. You're seeing that he goes around looking smart with hair and curls, smoothed daily with hair removal. This was the portrait of a Corinthian public speaker, something we should recognize pretty quickly when we see some of the celebrities in our own culture. Corinth had plenty of them as well. And these public speakers really enjoyed the favor of the wealthy. The crowds loved them. They had influence among the who's who of the world. They had everything, it seemed. You see, in this world, the world of the orators, the public speakers, it contrasted pretty dramatically with what the Corinthians saw in the church. That's particularly in the Apostle Paul. Because the Apostle Paul was nothing like an orator. In fact, in many ways, he was the opposite of what a Corinthian celebrity orator was like. When Paul lived in Corinth previously, he worked as a tent maker by day. Not exactly a glorious job. It seems that he didn't even accept support for the congregation, but earned his own wage. We learned in chapter 11 that the Corinthians didn't necessarily appreciate that, and were suspicious of why Paul wouldn't have lived like an orator. Maybe they even considered it demeaning for their preacher and leader to live such a humbling, demeaning life, so unlike the prestige of the public speakers. And Paul wasn't even a very good speaker either. And in many ways, he lived an afflicted, humble life. It seemed that Paul was the opposite of what a successful person and speaker should be. And so the great question that's generated by all of this is this. Is the sort of afflictedness and the suffering of Paul, is that a sign that his ministry is a failure? That he shouldn't be listened to? Is the fact that Paul is so unlike an orator, does that mean that his ministry isn't really worth much? Does that reflect on his message? Is the message of the gospel supposed to come with celebrity speakers, or can it come from a humble, afflicted man like Paul? And so we have our theme. A servant of Christ is encouraged in adversity. The treasure of Jesus comes through dying earthenware. Number 1, we'll see power from weakness, and number 2, we'll see life out of death. Because in our verse 7 of our passage, we learn that Paul is actually comforted by his afflicted status. He welcomes it. Look what he says. Verse 7. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. And so it's surprising, You have this accusation that, why aren't you more like a Corinthian public speaker, like a celebrity? And Paul just, forget it. I'm actually good with the way I am. I don't want anything like that. I'm a clay pot. You see, Paul has a treasure that makes him different. It's interesting that he uses the word treasure here. I have this treasure. Matthew 13, verse 44, Jesus talks about treasure, and Paul echoes that. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure buried in a field that a man found and reburied. And then in his joy, he sells everything he has, and he buys that field. And so right away, we realize that Paul's a little bit different than the Corinthian orators. Because unlike an orator, his life is based on something completely different. His own status is not at issue. Paul's life is about a treasure. He's carrying a treasure in the pot. So unlike the orators and celebrities. But even so, verse 7 is still a bit of a shock. I mean, compared to the glory of Jesus Christ, the glory of the treasure, is it really true that human beings who proclaim the treasure should be seen as clay pots? Is that really the case? Is it really a consequence of carrying the gospel treasure that if I'm a gospel preacher, you should see me as a jar of clay, an earthenware pot? Because frankly, brothers and sisters, for the Romans and Greeks, a comparison to pottery is not flattering. Pottery was cheap and plentiful. Pottery was the cheapest way to make a container that could carry something. Maybe an equivalent for us to pottery to the Romans is plastic containers. Tupperware. The value of a Tupperware container, as all of you know, is entirely in the function that it serves its contents. It has no value really in itself other than function. And the Romans and Greeks, of course, did store valuables sometimes in clay jars. So Paul's analogy did make a lot of sense to them. In fact, recently in 2008, a soapstone jar of gold coins was found buried under an Italian theater near Milan. But again, the news report is somewhat illuminating. You see, this jar is found full of gold coins. And then the article says, the precious coins were taken to a laboratory. And then the article ends. Didn't say anything about the jar. Nobody cares about the jar. They care about the gold that was in the jar. Even now it's the case. And so Paul's point is direct and unmistakable. There's no avoiding the import of this passage. The minister or the messenger of the gospel can be seen as a jar of clay, a bag of dirt, compared to the glory of the gospel he preaches. Just as a priceless painting is worth millions but held in a cheap frame, so the gospel of Jesus Christ is given to and preached by fragile, weak, lowly containers. That is precisely what this says. And again, I think we still wonder, really? Is it really the case? Is that really the truth, that ministers who carry the gospel are really worth nothing compared to the gospel? Is Paul really suggesting that you should see all of the preachers in your life as earthen Tupperware? We have to read verse 7 again. What does verse 7 actually say? We have this treasure in jars of clay. Why? To show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. The power in a ministry, according to Paul, never lies with the messenger when it comes to the gospel. The power lies with the gospel itself, with Jesus Christ and his Holy Spirit. And because the power belongs to God and not the messenger, it can then therefore be appropriate that the messenger isn't worth much. Maybe so that the messenger doesn't distract people from the glory of the message. And you might still wonder why. Why? And maybe an illustration is needed to sort of make sense of this. Maybe consider the following illustration. As Canadians, we all know about the Stanley Cup, right? Lord Stanley's Cup is a great Canadian treasure, we could say. Now, many of us know that the Stanley Cup also spends a great deal of time on the road, visiting various places. Every summer, for example, after the hockey season, the Stanley Cup spends 100 days on the road with the winning NHL team. What you may not know, though, is that there is an official keeper of the cup, the person who accompanies the Stanley Cup wherever it goes. The current keeper of the cup is a man named Phil Pritchard. Here's the point that I want to make here. If the Stanley Cup goes to your local town, people would want to go see it, wouldn't they? Generally speaking, that's the case. The cup is a famous Canadian treasure, isn't it? Now imagine if crowds went to go see the Stanley Cup, and Phil Pritchard, the keeper of the cup, suddenly decided to think that the crowds were actually there to see him. You and I both know that that wouldn't make any sense, would it? If Phil Pritchard, the keeper of the cup, has any honor or fame, it's because of the treasure that he holds and carries. How shameful would it be if Phil Pritchard thought that he was the attraction, the center of attention, rather than the Stanley Cup? You see, and this is what the Apostle Paul is getting at. He's saying, look, my life, my ministry is all about the treasure that I carry. And what he's saying to the Corinthians, he's saying, look, if you don't get that, you're missing the point. If you think that this ministry is all about me and not about the treasure that I carry, you are missing the very message of my ministry. Whatever honor I have, Paul's saying, is completely derived from the message that I preach, from the God who loves me and who I'm preaching about. If it's Christ who died for Paul, and if it's Christ that died for you and I, if it's Christ that builds the church, if it's Christ that builds this church and maintains this church, then the weaknesses of Paul and the weaknesses of your preacher can only serve but to magnify that treasure, as long as that treasure is actually preached. And Paul's point isn't necessarily that weakness is good in of itself, like somehow we should act weak. No, Paul's point is that our weaknesses serve to promote Christ. That our strengths, hopefully, serve to promote Christ, and our weaknesses promote Christ. And through both, Christ is preached and served. I mean, even if we have so-called strengths, even they are given by Christ, aren't they? What truly is the capability of a human being, if we're honest with ourselves? But in God, all things are possible, Matthew 19. It sounds simple in many ways, doesn't it? But I think often in our church and in any church, we live the opposite of this. We spend a lot of our time focusing on the strength of the church. Our mental energies are often focused on things like the fortunes of the seminary or the church budget, or whether we have enough strong young men going into the ministry. Sometimes maybe the charisma of preachers on the internet. The political situation of our nation worries us. What will the church do if we go under persecution? And on and on. Or sometimes maybe we belong to churches where we didn't quite like the pastor. And he didn't do enough. Or the elders didn't do this and the elders didn't do that. Or people in the congregation, they fail here and they fail there. They're not, this church isn't friendly enough. On and on and on it goes. Paul's saying here, look, it's not really the point. It's not really the goal. Whether I am weak or whether I am strong is not really here or there. Paul's saying, look, well, the point is that the gospel's preached, that Jesus is taught, that Jesus is believed in and known. I mean, when the Pharisees asked Jesus at the triumphal entry, remember the story? Jesus enters the city of Jerusalem, and he's walking up to Jerusalem, and crowds of people are welcoming Jesus Christ as he goes into Jerusalem. And the Pharisees are angry with Jesus, and they say to Jesus, rebuke the crowds so that they stop cheering for you. It's inappropriate that all these people are cheering for you as you enter Jerusalem. And Jesus' answer to the Pharisees is this: I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out. And I think there's a metaphor there for the church. If even these were silent, if even we were silent, the very stones would cry out the glory of God. And that's not to say the church isn't important or that we should stop doing what we do. The point is that Jesus can have his way. Jesus is Lord. If he wants the gospel preached, if he wants the church built, he will do it. The privilege is that he uses us to do it. The fact that Christ even uses human preachers at all is a privilege for the preacher. The same goes for us members. But I think that in line with this sermon series, we don't want to lie on the negative. We should talk about the positive here. The fact is, brothers and sisters, the treasure in earthenware is actually an immense comfort to you and I. If we're honest, most of us came here feeling small and weak. I think a lot of us are lonely. A lot of us feel inadequate. Some of us suffer with mental and physical frailties and sicknesses. Some of us have jobs maybe that we're barely able to do. We're too busy. We feel stretched. How many of us live this way? How many of us really feel strong at the end of the day? And so, brothers and sisters, for Paul to call himself an apostle, a jar of clay, and to say, that's okay. It's okay that I'm a small, afflicted, lowly preacher. If the Apostle Paul can say that about himself, and that's good and okay, then how much more then could we draw that comfort to our own lives as members and office bearers and all these things? That we can be weak and that God can still use us and is still using us, and that God's okay with that. Because sometimes I think we come to church and we think, oh, if only I was strong like the person sitting next to me or over there. If only I had a strong faith. If only I had the strength to do this and this for God. If only I had the strength to keep my family together. Then things would be good. Then I'd make it. But here in this passage we're reading that that's not really it. It's fine that you feel weak. It doesn't feel very nice. But God's okay with it. And God will strengthen you to the extent that he believes that you need it. In fact, what Paul is saying here really is that the weaknesses that you carry are often there precisely so that they can promote Jesus and his strength in your life. How radically different that is than the way our world works, isn't it? And how radically different that is than the way the Corinthians used to think. They wanted some fancy guy with, bleached teeth standing at the front of the church acting like a celebrity. With a giant video ministry, who knows what else? A big fancy church building, full pews, rich church. Paul's saying, forget it. No, be lowly and be okay with being lowly to preach Jesus because it's about him anyway. And this definitely applies to us, and I can say that this applies to all of us, especially so because for Paul to speak this way, in fact, reflects the life of Christ. In case you don't remember, Jesus Christ came to this earth not as a strong man, quote unquote, even though he was strong. I mean, remember how Jesus walked around the earth? What kind of attitude did Jesus have when he walked on the earth? Jesus came as a humble servant. And that's why the Pharisees just could not figure him out. It says in Philippians 2 verse 8, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Jesus won his victory by being nailed to a cross. Not by raising an army and going and beating the Romans and becoming some sort of dictator. No, Jesus came and succeeded by dying. That's how I know that this passage applies to every one of us. Because it follows the path of Jesus. Jesus accepted that he would be a humble, afflicted man, and that's how he lived his ministry. He wasn't actually weak, he was actually very strong. But he accepted the position of humility as a pathway to victory. And so Paul says it later in 2 Corinthians, the passage that we read earlier, right? For when I am weak, I am strong. And he's okay with that. We can reach our second point, life from death, as Paul continues this theme. Verses 8 through 9, Paul continues with a curious list, if you notice. He says, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. And so we learn a bit more about the affliction and suffering of Paul, which we read earlier in chapter 11, right? He's afflicted in every way, but he's not crushed. Hard pressed, but not cornered. In that sense, I suffer, but nothing can truly defeat me because I have Christ. He's perplexed, but he's not driven to despair. The word for perplexed here is the same word that's used when the woman come to the tomb of Jesus and they find the tomb empty. They're confused. How can there be an empty tomb? It doesn't make any sense. And Paul's saying much of his life is lived that way. He lives and he's confused. I would apply this immediately. I'd imagine that most of us are confused most of the time or some of the time. We don't always know the answers to life's questions. We don't always understand our own theology. We don't understand why God sends certain things in our life. And if that's you, you've got company with Paul. Sometimes we think that because he was an apostle, he had all figured out. It doesn't sound like it. No. Your salvation is not based on how clearly you think necessarily. It's based on what Jesus did for you. And so Paul's comforted by that. I'm confused, but it's not the end of me. And he's persecuted but not forsaken. Again, the word for forsaken is the same as Jesus uses on the cross on his final words. Eloi, Eloi, why have you forsaken me? And so here we read that Jesus was forsaken by men and God so that you and I never would be. And so Paul's saying, look, I may be persecuted, but I will never be forsaken the way Jesus was. What a comfort that is. And Paul is struck down but not destroyed. The Greek could be read maybe as knocked down but not knocked out. There's a bit of poetry here. Paul is struck down, he's knocked down, but again, it will never knock him out of the game. He's never truly done. He's never truly separated from the love of God. It says that in Romans 8. He can be struck down, but nothing ever can separate him from God and his love. Neither death nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, not things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. That's what he confesses here. You see, he can admit that he's a clay pot. He can say, I am weak compared to the message. I am small. But that doesn't therefore mean that I'm forsaken, or that God abandons me, or that I'm left without hope. It's one of these things that's parallel to the gospel. The gospel, we often carry what seems like a paradox often. I'm completely forgiven, but I'm still a sinner. It's hard to reconcile. This is one of those things that seems like a paradox. As a Christian, you can admit that you're small, that you're weak, but you can also admit that you're completely confident that God will be with you and that he has you. You can be hopeful in weakness, which seems the opposite of what we would think in the world. Jesus is forgiven so that you never will be. And with that knowledge, we can be weak in confidence. And Paul continues in verses 10 through 11. And he says this, are always carrying in the body, let's see where, we always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may be revealed in our mortal body. He's always being carried over to death. And in this verse, he's talking about his apostolic life, the life that God called him to live. God called Paul, we saw that this morning, and he sends Paul to be a missionary to the nations. And that is not an easy thing, especially in the Roman Empire when hardly anybody knows about Jesus. It's not like, in North America, a lot of people are Christians. It's not as dangerous to be a missionary. But for Paul to be a missionary was extremely dangerous, and it was hard. And we read in the chapter 2 Corinthians 11, we read about what happened to Paul because God made him become a missionary. A depth of suffering that you and I could hardly even imagine, being beaten, stoned. And Paul's saying, yeah, that's my life. That's how I live. But he's saying, you know what? That's happening so that the life of Jesus might come out of me. I'm dying for Jesus so that the life of Jesus can be preached by me and can be revealed out of my life and my suffering and my teaching. You notice that he says it twice. Right? For we who are alive, and then there's verse twice. And he can't even say it once. He's got to say it again and again. This is how my life is lived. This is what scholars often call the life of cruciformity. And that what scholars mean by that is they're saying, look, the path of a Christian will often resemble the path of Jesus. And this is particularly true in the death and suffering of Jesus. In fact, the death and suffering of Jesus are a paradigm by which you can understand your own life. Anyone who is called to follow Jesus will often be called to follow a similar type of life. Cruciformity. And to Paul, he believed that. He said, look, his call to be an apostle meant suffering like Jesus. This is something that's not limited to Paul. Now, you may wonder, of course, at this point, why is that true? Why is it that following Jesus entails suffering? Wouldn't you say that it's better to say that Jesus suffered so that I wouldn't have to suffer? And maybe there's a deeper question here. Isn't suffering evil? Isn't suffering a consequence of sin? Why would I have to suffer? Why would Paul have to suffer? Why did he have to suffer so deeply as an apostle? But it's important to remember what Paul is actually saying. Paul's actually bringing something out of suffering, something good. Look what he says. He suffers, he dies, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested or revealed in our bodies. You might say, why? What's the life of Jesus? How does the life of Jesus come out of the dying of Jesus in my life? How does that even work? What is that? Well, you need to understand the life he's talking about is probably best explained as the fruits of the Spirit. And also the work that Paul was able to do, the preaching and teaching that he was able to do in his life. And so Paul's saying here, he's saying, look, because I'm suffering and afflicted, and because all of these things are happening in me, God is using that to draw something out of me, to build something out of me. My suffering has enabled me to grow to become like Christ in more and more ways. It's enabled me to preach Christ even more boldly than I would have been able to before. You may ask, well, how does suffering produce good? Again, how does suffering produce those things? What's the connection between those two things? Well, we can say a few things about that. It's through suffering that we actually confront the reality of our world, isn't it? I think sometimes we think that suffering is an anomaly in our lives. When we say that, we forget that this world is a world of suffering. You see, your temporary comforts and prosperity are nothing but a mask, really, for the true state of what this world actually is. I think you can spend some time in certain neighborhoods of our city to get an accurate picture of that. This world in so many ways is a world of suffering. I mean, only yesterday or a few days ago, I read about 5 young children in Edmonton. They were locked in a basement for weeks and beaten when they complained. You say, oh, that's an anomaly. I'm not so sure it is. It's only the restraining power of Jesus Christ as Lord that prevents our world from being even worse than it already is. And suffering, therefore, is a megaphone. It shouts the reality of a broken world at those of us who live in it. It shatters your illusions. And the writer of Amazing Grace, John Newton, he once said it this way. He said, though we say this world is vain and sinful, we are too fond of it. And though we hope for true happiness only in heaven, we are often well content to stay longer here on earth. But the Lord sends afflictions one after another to quicken our desires and to convince us that this world cannot be our rest. As C.S. Lewis once said, suffering shouts our need for deliverance at us. It shouts the fact that Jesus Christ and God in heaven are the only good things that this world has to offer you. Jesus Christ, with the Father and the Holy Spirit, are the only truly good that actually exists. Or maybe you could include angels or something, but the fact of the matter is, if you don't know Jesus, you will never know the best, the greatest thing that this world is. Nothing else can satisfy you, love you, care for you like Jesus can. That is the reality in this passage. And so Paul's saying, look, I can be afflicted. I can be beaten. I can be starved. I can be all of those things. Those things remind me that Jesus is the only thing that I need. Those things remind the world and the people who listen to me that my message is the only thing that I actually have to offer them. They prevent Paul from being someone who would distract people from the gospel. Suffering destroyed his old idols just as it's going to destroy yours. The idols, things of this life that we serve because we think that in them we will experience joy and satisfaction. Suffering strips our idols and pride away in the furnace. And then when the pride and it's stripped away, then the life that Jesus is building in us, the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, these things begin to appear. As suffering teaches us that Jesus is the only thing that we can cling to. I once knew a man who taught me about this personally. This was a man who lived most of his life in a wheelchair. He was actually a man of immense strength in his teenage years. He set multiple provincial records in track and field, this man. Some of them just still exist, to my knowledge. But one day in his late teens, this man, he drank too much alcohol and he jumped into a shallow pool head first. He broke his neck. He was paralyzed from the neck down, and he only experienced limited mobility in his hands from then on. And what followed, this was many years ago, and what followed was a life of suffering in more ways than you and I could imagine. His health constantly breaks down. He experiences continual debilitating pain. He's unable to do most of the things that we enjoy. He's unable to have children. Yet through it all, through many twists and turns, he gained Christ, who he did not have before. And in Christ, he believes that his suffering has purpose. Where he says, I'm paralyzed just enough to strip my pride away, he says. Just enough to prevent him from being too proud to serve Christ. He's a perfect example of a person through whom suffering brought him to Jesus and keeps him in Jesus. And so, Paul can say in verse 12, so death is at work in us, but life in you. Paul the Apostle suffered in order to reach the Corinthians. We read in chapter 11 about all the things that he endured to bring the gospel to those who needed it. And he's saying, look, death is at work in me, and that's okay. It's all worth it for the sake of you knowing Jesus Christ. And if my suffering, he says, makes it better or easier or more possible for him to preach the gospel to those who need it, then so be it. It's worth it. The clay Tupperware status of Paul means that the power of the gospel is not with him, but with God. And it makes that very unmistakably clear. And brothers and sisters, that is actually an encouragement, even if it sounds really hard. If our faith was truly in the power of men, where do you think we would be right now? This church certainly wouldn't exist. Few of you would really know the gospel, if at all. There probably wouldn't even be a gospel if everything was about what men can do. But the lowliness of Paul shows us that it's okay to be weak, and that through weakness the gospel and the power of God can still go out. What a witness it is that through the Apostle Paul, a weak, lowly man, the church in the early Roman Empire goes from a handful of people in AD 33, and it becomes the dominant religion in the Roman Empire by the 3rd century, or 4th century, the time of Constantine. And you could say, maybe that was because they were really smart at spreading their faith, blah, blah, blah. No way. If Paul is the kind of person that's spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ, there is no explanation for the spread of the Christian faith. And so Paul can say, I'm a clay jar, and that's okay, as long as the gospel is magnified because of it. There's no human explanation for what he's able to do. There's no explaining away the power of God if the men who preach it are weak and small. And that is a comfort to you and I. Because it means that God is not asking you to be strong. He's not asking me to be strong. He's asking us to believe. To believe and to trust that he will spread the gospel through faithful people. You and I are here by the power of God, and you and I will enter heaven through the power of God, if you believe. And so, brothers and sisters, the message this morning is, despite your weakness, God can and is using you. And despite your weakness, he's not unhappy with you. He's not angry at you. And he's not going to use you for things that you're not capable of. The thing that he's asking you to do is to trust him and to live for him. And to just believe in his grace and that you actually are forgiven. That's what he's asking you to do. And if you do that, then he can use you. Not by your own strength, but through his might. Not by my power, but by his might. And that's the message, and that's the gospel. Amen.